He never showed up for family, Uncle Gary said to the notary, his voice carrying that tone of righteous disappointment he'd perfected over the years. My name is Mark Ellison. I'm 52 years old, a financial planner who'd been semi-retired for the past 3 years after selling my practice in Asheville, North Carolina. I wasn't there to hear those words directly. I was 600 miles away in Topeka, Kansas, standing in a cemetery watching them lower my godfather into the ground, while my uncle and cousins were busy rewriting my grandfather's will behind my back. The irony wasn't lost on me later. There I was, honoring a man who'd been more of a father to me than my own dad ever was, while my blood relatives were using my absence as evidence that I didn't care about family. But that's getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and explain how we got to that moment, because the story really starts with understanding who these people were and what they thought they knew about me. My grandfather, Samuel Ellison, had been the anchor of our family for as long as I could remember. He'd built a successful hardware store in the 1960s, expanded into 3 locations by the 1980s, and had the good sense to sell out to a regional chain just before the big box stores started moving into our area. Smart man, careful with money, conservative in all the right ways. He'd accumulated a trust fund worth about $2.4 million by the time he passed at 89, and he'd named me as the executor and primary trustee years earlier. That decision hadn't made my Uncle Gary particularly happy. Gary was my father's younger brother, about 67 now, and he'd spent most of his adult life expecting that money to eventually flow his way. He had 2 sons, my cousins Trent and Lucas, 35 and 32 respectively, who'd inherited their father's sense of entitlement, along with his tendency to live beyond their means. Nice enough guys when times were good, but they had expensive habits and a casual relationship with responsibility. What they didn't know, what none of them had ever bothered to pay attention to, was that I'd been quietly supporting the family for years. When Trent had his struggle with pills back in 2019 and needed a 30-day residential program that his insurance wouldn't cover, I'd written the check, $18,000, never asked for it back, never mentioned it again. When Uncle Gary's roof started leaking and he was looking at a $15,000 repair that would have wiped out his savings, I'd handled that too. Told him it was a gift from Grandpa's emergency fund, let him keep his pride intact. I'd learned long ago that the best way to help family was quietly, without fanfare or expectations. My late wife Mia had always said I was too generous for my own good, but she understood. We'd been blessed with success in the financial planning business, and our daughter Emma was doing well at Duke on a partial scholarship. We could afford to be generous, and family mattered. But generosity, I'd discovered, doesn't always buy you loyalty. Sometimes it just makes people comfortable taking you for granted. The call about my godfather came on a Tuesday morning in early October. Frank Morrison had been battling cancer for 2 years, and his daughter called to let me know he'd taken a turn for the worse. Wasn't expected to make it through the week. I'd known Frank since I was 8 years old. He'd been my father's business partner, my confirmation sponsor, the man who'd taught me how to drive a stick shift and how to read a financial statement. When my own father died of a heart attack when I was 28, Frank had stepped into that role without being asked. I booked a flight for Thursday morning, planning to spend a long weekend with Frank's family and help with arrangements. Emma drove up from Durham to see me off, knowing how much Frank had meant to me over the years. "We have an estate attorney," she reminded me as I was packing. "If anything happens while you're gone, Michael Harrison has all the paperwork." I'd smiled at her practicality. 20 years old and already thinking like the lawyer she planned to become. That turned out to be more prophetic than either of us realized. Frank passed on Friday evening. I spent the weekend with his family, helping with arrangements, sharing stories, doing what you do when a good man dies. The funeral was Monday morning, and I'd planned to fly back Tuesday afternoon. It was during the reception after the service that my phone buzzed with a text message that changed everything. The message was from my neighbor back home, Betty Walsh, who'd been checking my mail while I was away. "Thought you should know," it read. "Gary and the boys were at your grandfather's lawyer's office this morning. Seemed important." Betty wasn't one for gossip, so when she took the trouble to send a message like that, it meant something was wrong. I called my uncle from the airport while waiting for my delayed flight. "Gary, it's Mark. How are things going?" Oh, Mark. His voice had that forced casualness that meant he was hiding something. Everything's fine. Just taking care of some paperwork for your grandfather's estate. Nothing urgent. How was the funeral? Very nice, I said. Frank would have appreciated all the people who came. Listen, I should be home tomorrow afternoon. Maybe we could grab lunch later in the week. Sure, Gary said quickly. No rush, though. We've got everything handled here. That phrase, "we've got everything handled," triggered something in my professional instincts. In nearly 3 decades of financial planning, I developed what Mia used to call my fraud radar, an ability to detect when clients or family members were managing information flow in ways that suggested hidden agendas. The tone, the timing, the unnecessary reassurance about routine paperwork. Every element pointed to deception. During the flight home, I used my phone to access the secure estate management system I designed for tracking family financial matters. Within minutes, I'd confirmed that no legitimate legal documents had been filed through any of the 3 law firms that held copies of my grandfather's will. I'd also verified that all financial accounts remained properly secured and that no unauthorized access attempts had been made to any estate-related documentation. Gary's paperwork wasn't showing up in any of the systems that would have recorded legitimate estate activity. I got home Tuesday around 6 in the evening, tired and still processing the grief of losing Frank. Emma had stocked my refrigerator and left a note saying she'd be back Thursday to check on me. Good kid. The house felt empty without Mia, even more so after a trip like this. But I had work to do. The first thing I did was call Michael Harrison, the estate attorney who'd handled my grandfather's will. Michael and I had been roommates at Wake Forest Law School before I decided finance was more my speed than litigation. But those 3 years of legal education had given me something most financial planners don't have, a deep understanding of how estate law actually works. Not just the basic planning principles they teach in certification courses. I could read probate statutes, understand filing deadlines, and recognize legal vulnerabilities that would escape someone without formal legal training. When I'd referred my grandfather to Michael years earlier, it wasn't just because he was ethical, though he was one of the most principled attorneys I'd ever known. It was because I knew he'd build an estate plan that could withstand exactly the kind of challenge we were now facing. I'd specifically requested that he include provisions for document authentication, witness verification, and fraud protection that went beyond standard practice. Mark, Michael's voice was tight when he answered. I was hoping you'd call. We need to talk. Can you come in first thing tomorrow morning? Of course, I said. What's going on? It's better if we discuss it in person, he said. But I will say this. Your uncle came to see me with a new will dated last month. Claims your grandfather changed his mind about the estate distribution. I told him I'd never seen the document before, and that I had the original will locked in my safe. He wasn't happy about that. I thanked Michael and hung up, then sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking. A new will dated last month. My grandfather had been in hospice care last month, barely conscious, certainly not in any condition to be making legal decisions. But Uncle Gary wouldn't have tried something this obvious unless he thought he could make it work. The next morning, I drove to Michael's office downtown. He had coffee waiting, and the expression of a man who'd seen too much human greed in his 30 years of practice. Your grandfather's original will is dated February 15th, 2023, he said, sliding a copy across his desk, witnessed, notarized, completely legitimate. It names you as executor and primary trustee of the estate, with provisions for your uncle and cousins to receive modest distributions, and your daughter to inherit the remainder upon your death. He pulled out another document. This is what your uncle presented yesterday, dated September 18th, 2024. It removes you entirely from any inheritance or trustee role, names your uncle as primary beneficiary, and claims your grandfather had lost confidence in Mark's commitment to family. The signature looks close, but the witness signatures are problematic. How so? I asked. The witnesses are a notary I've never heard of and someone named Jennifer Walsh. The address listed for Jennifer Walsh is 1247 Oak Street. That's a vacant lot, Michael said. Has been for 5 years since they tore down the old Methodist church. Whoever prepared this didn't do their homework. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Jennifer Walsh. My neighbor Betty's daughter-in-law, who'd moved to Florida 2 years ago after her divorce. Someone had used her name and made up an address. This wasn't just family greed. This was fraud. What's the timeline for filing? I asked. The fraudulent will needs to be filed within 15 days of death to be considered valid, Michael said. Your grandfather died on September 30th. Today is October 15th. They missed the window by 36 hours. But here's what I want you to understand, Michael continued. Even if they'd filed on time, this document wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. The legal errors are too obvious, the witnesses are clearly fabricated, and I have testimony that your grandfather was not competent to execute a new will in September. But they didn't know that when they tried to file it. I drove home thinking about timing. In estate law, timing is everything. File too late, and even a legitimate document becomes worthless. File too early, and you might miss important information that changes everything. My grandfather had taught me to be patient, to gather information before making decisions. Apparently, Uncle Gary had never learned that lesson. That afternoon, Uncle Gary called. Mark, we need to talk about your grandfather's final wishes. He had some concerns about the family situation that he wanted to address. I see, I said. When did he express these concerns to you? Well, it was just before he passed. He was worried about Emma's college expenses and thought maybe the trust should be handled differently. That was a mistake on Gary's part. Emma's college expenses were covered by a combination of scholarships, her 529 plan that I'd been funding since she was born, and a separate education trust my grandfather had established years earlier. Gary had just revealed that he didn't understand the actual financial structure of the family, despite trying to manipulate it. I think we should meet with the lawyer together, I said. Make sure everyone understands the situation clearly. Gary hesitated. Well, we've already consulted with someone about the legal requirements. Everything's being handled properly. I'm sure it is, I said. Michael Harrison is expecting all of us Friday morning at 10. We can review everything together then. The silence on the other end of the phone told me everything I needed to know. Gary had been counting on filing his fraudulent will without my knowledge and presenting me with a fait accompli. The idea of sitting across from a table from an ethical attorney who'd known my grandfather for 20 years was not part of his plan. Friday morning arrived with the first real cold snap of autumn. I got to Michael's office 15 minutes early and found Uncle Gary and my cousins already there, looking like men who'd rather be anywhere else. Trent was fidgeting with his phone, Lucas kept checking his watch, and Gary had the expression of someone who'd walked into a trap. Michael handled the meeting with professional precision. He presented the original will, explained its provisions, and then addressed the attempted filing of the fraudulent document. The legal term for what you attempted is forgery, he said, looking directly at Gary. The fabricated witness signatures, the false address, the forged signature of a man who was not competent to execute legal documents. Any one of those elements would invalidate the document. All three together constitute criminal fraud. Gary's face went red. Now wait just a minute. Samuel was very clear about his concerns regarding Mark's dedication to this family. He never showed up for family events, never visited unless there was some financial discussion. He was at a funeral, I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken since the meeting began. When you were preparing this document, I was in Kansas burying a man who'd been more of a father to me than my own dad ever was. The room went quiet. Frank Morrison raised Mark from the time his father died, Michael said. He's been quietly supporting your family for years without asking for recognition or repayment. The man you claim never showed up for family, paid for your son's rehabilitation and your roof repair, among other things. I watched the expression change on Trent's face as that information sank in. He'd never known where the money for his treatment had come from. His father had let him believe it was some kind of family emergency fund, probably to avoid admitting that his nephew was more financially responsible than his father. The meeting ended with Michael explaining that the original will would be entered into probate immediately, and that any further attempts to contest it would be met with criminal fraud charges. Gary and my cousins left without saying goodbye, which told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. I stayed behind to sign some paperwork and talk through the next steps with Michael. You handled that well, he said. A lot of people would have been angry, made accusations, turned it into a family war. Sometimes the best response is just to let the truth speak for itself, I said. My grandfather taught me that patience usually wins over impulse. Over the next few weeks, I learned more about what had happened while I was in Kansas. Gary had approached a lawyer with a reputation for taking questionable cases and had the fraudulent will prepared using information he'd gathered from my grandfather's personal papers. He'd convinced someone to pose as a notary, used a false name for the second witness, and had genuinely believed that filing the document would be enough to override the original will. What he hadn't counted on was that Michael Harrison was one of the most respected estate attorneys in western North Carolina, and that the original will had been properly filed and secured years earlier. He also hadn't realized that estate law requires specific procedures and timelines that can't be circumvented by enthusiasm or desperation. The probate process took about 4 months to complete, during which time Gary and my cousins made several attempts to challenge the proceedings. Each attempt revealed more evidence of their poor understanding of the legal system and their willingness to make accusations they couldn't support. The final hearing was in February, and I remember sitting in the courtroom listening to the judge explain why their objections had no legal merit. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse knowing that I was now the trustee of a substantial estate, responsible for managing assets that would eventually benefit my daughter and, in smaller ways, the broader family. The original will included provisions for modest distributions to Gary and his sons, but those distributions were contingent on family harmony and good faith behavior. Given their actions during the probate process, those provisions were no longer operative. I did make one decision that I think my grandfather would have approved of. Using funds from the estate, I established a scholarship at the local community college in my grandfather's name, specifically for students from families dealing with addiction or financial hardship. The first recipient was a young woman whose father had struggled with alcoholism, but who was working 2 jobs to pay for her accounting degree. She reminded me of what second chances could look like when they were offered to the right person. Emma graduated from Duke that spring, with a degree in political science and plans to attend law school. She'd watched the entire estate situation unfold with the analytical mind of someone who understood that family dynamics and legal principles don't always align. "Dad," she said to me after the scholarship award ceremony, "I think Grandpa Samuel would be proud of how you handled all this. You didn't try to punish anyone. You just let the system work the way it was supposed to." That summer, I ran into Trent at the grocery store. It was the first time we'd spoken since the meeting in Michael's office. He looked older, more tired than a 35-year-old should look. "Mark," he said, "I wanted to apologize for what happened. I didn't know about the money you'd given us over the years. Dad never told us. I appreciate that," I told him. "Family's complicated sometimes. How are things going for you?" "Better," he said. "I've been sober for 8 months now. Got a job with a landscaping company. It's honest work." We talked for a few more minutes, and I could see that he'd learned something from the whole experience. Not about estate law or financial planning, but about the difference between what people say they value and what they actually do when tested. Before we parted ways, I gave him my business card. "If you ever want to talk about financial planning or just need some advice," I said, "I'm still your cousin." I never heard from Uncle Gary again. According to mutual friends, he'd developed a reputation around town as someone who'd tried to cheat his own nephew out of an inheritance while the nephew was attending a funeral. In a small community like ours, that kind of reputation follows you everywhere. He moved to Florida about a year later, supposedly to be closer to his ex-wife's family, but everyone understood he was running from the shame of what he'd tried to do. Looking back on the whole situation, I learned something important about the difference between being quiet and being weak. I'd spent years being the family member who helped without asking for credit, who solved problems without making announcements, who showed up when needed without expecting recognition. Gary and my cousins had mistaken that quiet reliability for weakness, assumed that my absence during a personal crisis meant I didn't care about family obligations. What they didn't understand was that I'd been preparing for situations like this for most of my adult life. 28 years in financial planning teaches you that people's true character emerges when money is involved, and that the best protection against greed and deception is meticulous documentation and ironclad professional relationships. Years earlier, when I'd first helped my grandfather establish his estate plan, I'd insisted on what we called a belt and suspenders approach. The original will wasn't just filed with Michael Harrison. I'd arranged for certified copies to be held by 2 separate law firms, with a third copy in a safety deposit box that only Emma and I could access. Every financial transaction, every family loan I'd made, every conversation about the estate had been documented in a secure digital file system that I'd designed specifically for estate management. When Gary tried his fraudulent scheme, he was operating against a system that had been built by someone who understood not just estate law, but information security, document authentication, and the psychology of family financial disputes. I'd learned to think 3 moves ahead, not because I expected betrayal, but because I'd seen too many families destroyed by poor planning and inadequate documentation. They spoke loudly about family loyalty while trying to steal from the family. I filed early and let the law speak for itself. The trust fund continues to grow, managed conservatively according to my grandfather's principles. Emma is finishing her first year of law school, funded by her education trust and her own academic achievements. The scholarship program has helped 12 students so far, including 2 who've gone on to complete 4-year degrees and start their own small businesses. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd been home when Gary and his sons made their move, if I'd confronted them directly instead of letting the legal system handle it. The outcome might have been the same, but the family relationships would have been destroyed by anger and accusations instead of simply being clarified by truth and consequences. Frank Morrison always used to say that the best revenge is living well and letting other people's choices catch up with them. I think he would have been proud of how this situation resolved itself. I honored his memory by attending his funeral, and in doing so, I protected my family's future from people who mistook my presence at a funeral for absence from responsibility. In the end, they got exactly what they deserved, nothing more than what was legally theirs, and the reputation that comes from trying to defraud family members during their time of grief. I got something more valuable, the knowledge that quiet integrity and careful preparation will always overcome loud greed and sloppy planning. Loyalty isn't loud, and silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes the best thing you can do is let other people reveal who they really are, while you quietly take care of the people and principles that actually matter.